Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going, well, a bit deeper than usual, maybe. We're not just looking at the day-to-day politics.
No, we're aiming for the foundations, the core ideas.
Exactly. We're exploring the foundational concepts of political theory itself, the ideas that sort of underpin everything else.
And to help us navigate this pretty complex terrain, we're using a specific text as our guide. It's called An Introduction to Political Theory by O.P. Galba.
Right, that's our map for this journey. So the plan today, using Goba as our base, is pretty ambitious, actually.
Uh-huh.
We want to unpack what that word political really means. We use it constantly, but pinning it down is harder than you might think.
It really is.
Then we'll look at the two main parts of political theory, as the source lays them out: political science and political philosophy.
Yeah, the eyes and the ought, roughly speaking.
Kinda, yeah, we'll get into
Yeah.
that. And crucially, why should we even care? What's the significance of this field?
And then there's that whole fascinating historical detour. The debate about whether political theory was, dying out in the mid-20th century.
Right, the decline debate. We'll dig into that, who is saying what and why.
And finally, bring it back to the present. Where does that discussion stand now? How do science and philosophy fit together today?
So, yeah, think of it as a journey into the DNA of how we think about society, government, power, all the big stuff.
It's about understanding the very language, the concepts we use to even talk about living together in communities.
Okay, let's jump in. Starting right at square one. What does political actually mean? The source makes a really useful starting point here, talking about institutions.
It does. It reminds us we all live in various institutions: family, school, maybe religious groups, workplaces,
Yeah.
and what the source calls the polity.
And all these institutions, they have some purpose, right? Some structure, they involve organization, and crucially, authority.
Yes, authority, which the source defines as that relationship of command and obedience. But importantly, it's not just about force.
Right, it implies something more. Like the commands are generally seen as, well, reasonable, legitimate.
Exactly. There's an expectation of obedience,
Mhm.
but it's based on acceptance, not just fear. Mild disagreements don't necessarily bring the whole thing crashing down.
So there's this element of accepted order,
Mm.
but the source singles out the polity, or the state, as being different from all those other institutions. What's the key difference?
The key difference, according to the source, is its scope. The polity is the organization that aims to regulate the whole community.
The whole thing, not just a specific group.
Right. It makes rules and decisions that apply to everyone within its territory, and it exercises authority over every single member, regardless of their other roles or affiliations, family, job, whatever.
And the source brings in Sheldon Wolin here, who apparently said the political arrangement is uniquely focused on what's common to the whole community.
Precisely. It's about the shared stuff, the collective interest, not just the private interests of individuals or smaller groups.
So when we think about typical state functions like national defense, keeping order inside the country, the justice system, managing the economy, why are those considered political?
Well, the source explains it's because the interests they serve are seen as benefiting, or at least applying to, all members of the community. National security protects everyone, right?
Mm.
Law and order benefits everyone. Justice is supposed to apply equally. Economic rules affect the whole system.
It's about that shared collective dimension. The source even throws in Aristotle for good measure.
Ah, yes, man is a political animal. For Aristotle in the ancient Greeks, living in a political community, the polis wasn't just convenient, it was natural. It was essential for human flourishing.
To be outside the polis was to be, what, less than human or more than human?
Basically, yeah.
Mm.
Either a beast or a god, as the saying goes. It shows just how central they saw the political community.
And the word political itself comes directly from polis, the Greek city-state.
Right. And the source describes these ancient city-states, small, geographically distinct communities with a really integrated social life.
And the crucial point for our discussion is that in the politics, everything aimed at the good life of the community was considered politics. Religion, education, culture. It was all wrapped up together.
Which is a huge contrast to how we generally view political today, isn't it?
Absolutely. The source highlights this major shift, the modern separation between a public sphere and a private sphere.
And that's fundamental to understanding the modern scope. Today, politics is usually confined to that public sphere.
So, government decisions, laws, elections, political parties, maybe social movements trying to change policy, that's political.
Yes. But things like your personal religious beliefs, how you educate your kids, unless the state regulates it, your taste in art, These are generally seen as part of the private sphere. They're not typically political unless they intersect with public order or safety concerns that require regulation.
So understanding this narrowing of the political to the public sphere is key. It's about the rules and authority governing our shared public life.
Got it. So political is about governing the shared concerns of the whole community, mainly in the public realm.
Okay, that's the political part pinned down, more or less. Now, theory. What does the source say about that?
Well, theory, according to the source, is pretty straightforward. It just means systematic knowledge, organized, structured understanding.
Not just random ideas or opinions.
Exactly. So putting them together, political theory is the systematic knowledge of political phenomena.
Simple enough. But the source immediately complicates things by talking about the kinds of statements involved in this knowledge.
Yes, and this is where we start seeing the internal tensions within the field. The source identifies three types of statements. First, you have empirical statements.
Based on observation, right? Like,
Yeah.
It's raining, you can check it with your senses.
Correct. Verifiable through experience. Second, logical statements. These are based on reasoning, like 2 plus 2 equals 4. Verifiable through the rules of logic.
Okay, empirical and logical. Verifiable. What's the third?
The third type is evaluative statements. These are based on value judgments. The example given is men are born free and equal.
Ah, okay. That sounds different. Not something you can just observe or calculate in the same way.
Precisely. And this is where a major debate comes in, one that we'll see flare up later. Because political science, particularly from a certain perspective the source discusses, tries to build its knowledge only on those first two types, empirical and logical statements.
Why only those two?
The rationale is that they are verifiable. Different people, using the same methods of observation or logic, should ideally reach the same conclusion. They offer a path to objective knowledge, or lead intersubjective agreement.
And evaluative statements?
Well, from the viewpoint of logical positivism, which the source explains had a huge influence, evaluative statements were seen as problematic. Positivism argued that true knowledge comes only from science, from sense experience.
So value judgments like freedom is good or equality is just.
From a strict positivist view, these lack empirical content or logical structure. They were often dismissed as just subjective opinions, emotional preferences, not statements of fact or logic.
Which led some people to argue for a value-free political science, right? Just describe what is, don't get mixed up in what ought to be.
Exactly. The aim was scientific objectivity, neutrality on values. Focus on describing and explaining political reality without judging it based on personal values.
But the source we're using, Galba's text, pushes back against this quite strongly.
It does. It argues that political theory cannot just be science in that narrow sense. It insists that grappling with values, with the ought, which is the realm of philosophy, is essential.
It doesn't accept that values are just subjective feelings.
No. The source suggests that values can have a rational basis, a logical structure. They can be discussed, debated, argued about through dialogue. We might not reach absolute certainty, but we can arrive at better justified principles, maybe even universal ones.
And what's the danger of ignoring this philosophical, value-based side?
The source warns that if political theory doesn't engage with questions of what is good or just, then those crucial decisions about society's goals get left to others, maybe people who are ignorant or self-interested or just seeking power. The consequences could be disastrous.
So the conclusion from this foundational section is that political theory needs both. It has to include both the scientific study of facts and the philosophical engagement with values.
That's the position the source takes right from the start. Political theory is presented as this integrated field encompassing both political science and political philosophy.
Okay, that makes sense. Two pillars supporting the whole structure. So let's delve deeper into these two pillars now, political science and political philosophy. The source uses insights from thinkers like Catlin and Hacker to flesh these out.
Right. George Catlin is mentioned as someone who explicitly divided political theory into these two branches.
So how did Catlin define political science? What was its job?
For Catlin, political science deals with the facts of political life. It's about understanding what's actually happening, the real situation, the laws or patterns that govern how people behave politically. He even saw value in linking it with sociology to understand social control more broadly.
Getting down to the nuts and bolts of how things work.
Pretty much. And Andrew Hacker, also cited, agrees. He says the political theorist acting as a scientist is focused on describing and explaining political realities. trying to formulate general rules or propositions about how states and citizens actually interact, how power actually operates.
So the focus is firmly on the empirical, the observable, the ease.
Yes, and the source goes on to detail the methodology political science aims to use, which is consciously modeled on the scientific method used in natural sciences.
Okay, walk us through that. How does it work?
Well, it starts with observation. You rely on your senses, on experience. You rule out supernatural explanations or things you can't observe,
Look, see, measure.
basically. Then comes generalization. Based on repeated observations, you look for patterns, regularities. You try to establish relationships or correlations between different factors.
Like if A happens, then B tends to follow.
Exactly. This can be inductive, going from specific observations to a general rule, or deductive, starting with a general hypothesis and testing it against specific observations. But the goal is a general statement, ideally one that can be quantified and verified by others.
Okay, observe, generalize. Then what?
Explanation. Why does that general rule hold? What are the underlying causes or reasons for the observed pattern? Making sense of the political events or situations.
Understanding the why behind the what.
Right. And finally, the source mentions prediction and prescription. If you understand the causes and patterns, you might be able to anticipate future outcomes. That's prediction. And based on that understanding, you might suggest actions to achieve certain goals, like making a system more stable or efficient. That's prescription.
So it's a cycle. Observe, find patterns, explain them, maybe predict, and potentially suggest solutions based on that knowledge.
That's the ideal, yes. Providing tools to understand the mechanics of politics.
The source mentions the behavioral approach here as a big push in this scientific direction.
Yes, that was hugely influential, especially mid-century. Behavioralism really doubled down on making political studies scientific. It shifted the focus from just looking at formal institutions like constitutions to studying the actual behavior of people in political contexts.
Like how people vote, why they join groups, how politicians make decisions.
Exactly. It often tried to break down complex situations into systems and processes involving behaviors that could be objectively measured and analyzed using scientific techniques.
But then came a reaction, or an evolution, the post-behavioral approach.
Right. This emerged a bit later, around the late 1960s. And interestingly, David Easton, a key figure in behavioralism, was also central to post-behavioralism. It didn't reject the scientific methods, but it insisted that the knowledge gained must be relevant to human values and used to address real-world problems and crises. It brought values back into the conversation, saying science needs a purpose. It needs to serve human ends, not just be pure knowledge for its own sake.
So a move back towards relevance and applying scientific findings to societal issues.
Definitely. It was a call to use the tools of political science to tackle the big challenges society was facing.
Okay, so that's political science. Empirical, methodological, focused on describing, explaining, predicting political reality. Now the other pillar, political philosophy. How do Catlin and Hacker see its role?
Catlin described political philosophy as being concerned with the kingdom of ends, final values.
Meaning
Meaning it asks the big ought questions. What is the good society? What's truly in the national interest? What values should guide our political life? It's about what's good for us, our ultimate goals.
and
Hacker echoes this. He says the political philosopher aims to prescribe the goals that citizens, states, societies ought to pursue. They try to generalize about right conduct and the legitimate uses of power. It's normative, focused on ideals and justification.
So science is asked, philosophy is ought, but the source adds a layer of nuance here, drawing on D.D. Raphael. It's not just about utopian ideals versus reality.
No, Raphael emphasizes that political philosophy is fundamentally critical.
Critical. How so?
It questions and evaluates the beliefs we often just take for granted in politics. It seeks justification, solid, rational reasons for accepting or rejecting certain political principles or arrangements. Why democracy? Why liberty? Why equality? Science explains causes. Philosophy seeks reasons and justifications for values.
So it's about digging deeper, questioning assumptions, demanding rational grounds for our political values?
Exactly. And the source highlights another vital function, clarification of concepts.
We touched on the problem of words having multiple meanings.
Right. And political philosophy takes on the task of clarifying key terms like authority, liberty, justice, democracy. These words are used everywhere, but often vaguely or inconsistently. Sheldon Woolen's point about authority applying to fathers, churches, and parliaments illustrates this.
So philosophy tries to establish clear, technical meanings for these terms when used in political discussion.
Yes. It involves analysis breaking down a concept like sovereignty into its parts, maybe defining it as supreme legal authority. It involves synthesis, showing how concepts relate, like how rights often imply obligations. And it involves improvement, recommending clearer definitions to avoid confusion, like maybe restricting sovereignty to just legal authority.
It's like trying to build a precise shared vocabulary for political argument.
Precisely. So that even people with different ideologies, say a liberal and a socialist, can at least agree on what they mean by freedom or equality, even if they disagree fundamentally on how to achieve it or how much of it is desirable. It allows for more productive debate.
And the danger if we don't have this clarity.
The source warns that vague or slippery terms become tools for manipulation. Demagogues can use emotionally charged words without clear meaning to sway crowds. Regimes can use words like democracy or freedom to legitimize oppressive practices.
Like Orwell's Newspeak, almost.
Kind of. But conversely, clear, well-defined concepts allow thinkers to build solid arguments. They don't have to reinvent the wheel conceptually every time. It allows the field to build knowledge systematically.
Okay, so science provides the facts, philosophy provides the values, the critique, and the conceptual clarity. But hackers stressed they're interdependent, right? Not separate silos.
Absolutely not. Hacker's point, highlighted in the source, is crucial. Good political philosophy needs good political science. To talk meaningfully about what society ought to be, philosophers need a solid grasp of political realities, human capabilities, social dynamics, how power actually works. You can't build castles in the air.
And does it work the other way, too? Does science need philosophy?
The argument is yes. The scientific study of politics isn't conducted in a vacuum. The questions a political scientist chooses to investigate, the facts they deem important, the way they interpret data. These choices are often guided, consciously or unconsciously, by some underlying philosophical assumptions about what matters in political life.
So what you choose to measure depends partly on what you think is valuable or important.
Often, yes. Hackers suggest that the scientific parts of a political theory really only make sense, gain coherence, if the writer has some background conception of the goals or purpose of politics, which is essentially a philosophical stance. He concludes that every political theorist is really part scientist, part philosopher.
They're intertwined. Now, the source makes another absolutely critical distinction here between political theory, science, and philosophy together, and something else, ideology.
This is huge, and Hacker is again central to this distinction. Real political theory, whether scientific or philosophical, must strive for what he calls scholarly detachment, disinterestedness, meaning the theorist should not have a personal axe to grind, no vested interest in reaching a particular conclusion. Their vision shouldn't be clouded by personal bias or partisan loyalty. It's not supposed to be special pleading for a cause they already support.
Okay, theory aims for detachment. What about ideology?
Ideology, by contrast, is defined as being fundamentally interested. Its purpose, according to the source, is to justify a particular system of power. The ideologue is an interested party. They're either defending the current power structure or attacking it to promote a different one.
So they start with the conclusion they want and build arguments to support it.
Often, yes. They might accept certain principles as non-negotiable truths without subjecting them to the same level of critical philosophical scrutiny or rigorous empirical testing that genuine theory demands.
And when theory gets tangled up with ideology, what happens?
It gets distorted. Political philosophy can become mere rationalization, finding clever arguments to justify a pre-existing commitment, whether it's to capitalism, socialism, nationalism, whatever. And political science can become biased and selective, highlighting only the facts that support the ideology and ignoring or downplaying inconvenient truths.
The source mentions examples like how supporters of capitalism might focus only on market efficiency, while supporters of socialism focus only on equality, each presenting a partial picture as the whole truth.
Exactly. Or how nationalists emphasize national unity above all, while internationalists emphasize global cooperation. These are fundamentally partisan viewpoints aimed at promoting specific power arrangements, which inherently conflicts with the detached pursuit of understanding that defines genuine theory.
So that scholarly detachment is really the gold standard for political theory.
It's presented as the key characteristic, yes. The commitment to follow the evidence and the arguments where they lead without being bound by a partisan agenda.
Okay, that clarifies the landscape significantly. We have political, we have theory as systematic knowledge with both scientific and philosophical parts, and we've distinguished it from ideology. Now let's tackle the big so what question. Why does political theory actually matter? What's its significance?
The source argues its significance flows directly from those complementary roles of science and philosophy we just discussed. They both contribute vital functions for social life.
Let's start with the contribution from the political science side. The source calls it control of social life. That sounds a bit strong.
Maybe understanding and management is a better way to think about it. The analogy used is with natural sciences. Just like geology helps us understand earthquakes and maybe mitigate risks, or medicine helps cure diseases.
Political science helps us understand social problems.
Exactly. It provides the scientific analysis to grasp the causes of things like social conflict, political instability, or violence. And by understanding the causes, we hopefully gain insights into how to prevent or manage these issues.
So it helps society develop, maybe find remedies for crises.
That's the idea. It helps us understand the dynamics, the resources, the potential pitfalls. It provides the practical knowledge, the understanding of cause and effect that gives us the means to navigate collective challenges and achieve shared goals more effectively.
Okay, so science gives us the how-to, the operational knowledge.
Right, the tools.
Now, what about political philosophy's contribution? The source talks about social criticism and reconstruction.
This is where the values come back in force. Philosophy engages directly with right and wrong, good and evil in politics. When something seems unjust or harmful in society, philosophy doesn't just describe it. It seeks the logical grounds for criticizing it.
And it doesn't stop at criticism.
No, it often goes further, speculating about alternatives. How can we build a better, more just, or good society? This is the reconstruction part.
The source mentions that galaxy of political philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Locke, Rousseau, Marx, Mill, and so on, they were all doing this.
Yes, in different ways. They diagnosed the problems they saw in their own times. Plato on selfish politicians, Machiavelli on self-interested human nature, Marx on class conflict, and they proposed alternative visions or schemes for how society could be better organized.
And the source says we don't have to accept their specific solutions as gospel truth.
No, but their analyses, their critiques, their visions, they offer incredibly rich insights. They help us recognize potential problems in our own societies and think creatively about possible remedies. They provide the ends, the vision of what we should be aiming for.
So science gives the means, philosophy gives the ends. One tells us how to get there, the other helps us decide where there should be.
That's a good way to put it. And the source stresses both are essential. You need effective means, but you also need worthwhile goals.
Okay, what else? The source brings up clarification of concepts again as a key significance of philosophy.
And it's worth reemphasizing because clear thinking requires clear language, especially in politics where words are so often loaded. Political philosophy tackles the hard work of defining those core concepts: liberty, justice, equality, authority.
Which is crucial because, as we said, these terms can be slippery and used to mislead.
Exactly. By striving for precise technical meanings, philosophy helps create a common ground for rational discussion. It allows people to debate substantive disagreements more effectively because they at least understand what the key terms mean. It helps prevent political language from becoming just noise or manipulation.
It provides the conceptual toolkit for the whole field.
Right. And allows for knowledge to be built cumulatively rather than everyone constantly arguing about basic definitions.
Finally, the source suggests the whole tradition of political theory fosters something broader: mutual respect and toleration. How does that work?
It draws on Andrew Hacker's idea of political theory as a never-ending conversation. Thinkers across centuries, despite huge disagreements, were engaging with each other's ideas, building arguments, offering critiques.
Like a long, slow debate club.
In a way. And the source suggests that engaging with this tradition, reading Plato alongside Marx, Locke alongside Rousseau, forces us to confront different perspectives, to see the potential weaknesses in our own views.
It encourages intellectual humility.
Hopefully, yes. It pushes us not just to persuade others, but also to be open to being persuaded when we encounter better arguments or evidence. Hacker even calls politics the most democratic of sciences, because ultimately, judging reality in the good life is a shared responsibility for everyone who studies it.
And this process of engaging with diverse, reasoned arguments cultivates respect for different viewpoints.
That's the argument. It models a way to disagree deeply about fundamental issues while maintaining a level of mutual respect, encouraging peaceful ways to navigate differences rather than resorting to force or hostility.
So, putting it all together, theory helps us understand and manage society, science, criticize it and envision alternatives, philosophy, clarify our thinking, philosophy, and engage in respectful debate. The whole tradition. That's quite a list of contributions.
It is. And the source concludes this part by stressing that all these functions are vital today, maybe more than ever, given the huge global challenges we're facing.
And it includes that warning attributed to David Helen. Without this systematic pursuit of political theory, politics can easily fall into the hands of the ignorant, the self-serving, or those just hungry for power.
It underscores why engaging with these ideas isn't just an academic luxury. It's arguably essential for a healthy democracy and informed citizenship.
Okay, this naturally leads us into that historical debate we mentioned earlier, the period in the mid-20th century, or around the 1950s, when there was serious talk about the decline of political theory. What was going on there?
Yeah, this was a really pivotal moment. It was fueled largely by the rise of that new political science, the behavioral movement we talked about, which was very focused on scientific rigor.
And David Easton was a key voice here, initially arguing against traditional theory.
Yes, in his earlier work from 1953, Easton basically argued that traditional political theory was too speculative, too disconnected from empirical reality.
He thought it was just armchair philosophizing.
Pretty much. He felt it was overly reliant on studying historical texts and lacked the sharp observational focus needed for a true science of politics. He wanted to rescue the field from the history of ideas, essentially.
And he saw traditional theory as belonging to past eras of crisis, ancient Greece, Renaissance Italy, revolutionary periods in England and France.
Right, he questioned its relevance for the modern world. A big point for him was the apparent lack of really towering original political philosophers after Marx and Mill in the 19th century. Why keep relying on these old ideas?
He also felt political science was lagging behind other social sciences.
Yeah, he argued economists and sociologists were doing a better job developing systematic research methods. He pointed to the failure of political scientists to really predict or explain huge events like fascism and communism, and noted they were often excluded from practical decision-making, like during World War II, where other social scientists got involved.
So his solution was behavioralism, a more scientific approach.
Yes, a political science focused on observable behavior, using methods closer to other social sciences, aiming for more predictive power and practical influence.
And crucially, in this early phase, he argued values were off limits for science.
Exactly. He saw values as relative, subjective preferences. Society would figure out its values somehow. The scientist's job was just to build causal theory explaining how things work. If X, then Y, not to get involved in prescribing what should be based on values. This focus solely on causal theory, excluding normative concerns, was a big part of why people felt theory, in the broader sense, including philosophy, was declining.
Though, as you said, he later shifted towards post-behavioralism, bringing values back in.
Yes, that's an important evolution in his own thought, recognizing the need for science to be relevant and address societal crises, which inevitably involves values. But in the 50s, the push was strongly towards value-neutral causal theory.
Were others making similar arguments about decline around the same time?
Oh, yes. Alfred Cobbin actually wrote a piece titled The Decline of Political Theory in 1953 as well.
What was his take?
Cobbin felt theory had lost its influence in both major systems of the time. In Western democracies, he saw practical politics dominated by bureaucrats and the military, with little room for theorists. In communist states, theory seemed dictated by the ruling party.
He also felt past theorists like Hegel and Marx were too narrow for modern complexities.
Yeah, focusing too much on the nation-state, Hegel, or just one class, Marx.
Yeah.
And like Easton, he blamed the logical positivists for sidelining value questions. But Cobbin held out some hope, suggesting theory could regain relevance by tackling fundamental questions and developing criteria for judgment.
And then there was Seymour Martin Lipset in 1960 with a perhaps even stronger claim.
Lipset's argument was particularly striking. He essentially claimed that the big ideological and philosophical questions about how to organize society were basically settled.
Settled. How so?
He famously argued that the United States, as a stable, liberal democracy, had more or less achieved the good society, or was the closest approximation to it in practice. If you believe that, then there's not much need for radical philosophical critiques or grand new visions, is there? The job becomes more about fine-tuning the existing system.
That really does sound like the end of ideology, or at least the end of fundamental political philosophy.
It reflected a certain confidence, perhaps complacency of that era, heavily influenced by positivism's focus on observable facts and dismissal of metaphysical or value-based questions as unscientific.
But not everyone agreed with this narrative of decline or the positivist approach. Who were the main critics?
Leo Strauss was a very prominent critic. Writing in the late 50s and early 60s, he flipped the script. He argued the new science wasn't the cure for decline, it was a symptom of it.
Why? What was his issue?
His main critique was its neglect of normative issues, the fundamental questions of good, right, and justice. He attacked what he saw as the value relativism of empirical theory, the idea that all values are equally valid preferences.
He thought that was dangerous.
Deeply dangerous. He argued that refusing to make distinctions between higher and lower values, treating all desires or goals as equal, essentially obliterates the distinction between men and brutes. It ignores the human capacity for reason and virtue. Strauss passionately defended the role of philosophy in discerning and upholding higher objective values.
So, for Strauss, abandoning philosophy was abandoning what makes us human.
In a political sense, yes. Abandoning the search for the best political order based on enduring principles.
Dante Germino is another thinker the source mentions, offering a kind of overview and looking forward.
Germino, writing a bit later, identified positivism, that craze for science, and the dominance of rigid political ideologies like Marxism as the main culprits behind the mid-century decline.
But he saw signs of life returning.
Yes. Crucially, Germino argued that by the late 60s and 70s, political theory was already experiencing a revival. He pointed to a new generation of thinkers like Oakeshott, Arendt, Strauss himself, Rawls, McPherson, who were engaging in profound philosophical inquiry again.
And Germino strongly identified political theory with political philosophy, didn't he?
He did. He defined it as the critical study of the principles of right order in society, an inquiry into right and wrong. He explicitly contrasted it with reductionist behavioral science, just facts, and dogmatic ideology, unquestioned beliefs.
So for Germino, theory needs both facts and philosophical insight.
Absolutely. Knowledge of political realities and the wisdom to understand and evaluate them. He stressed that philosophy deals with perennial problems, timeless questions about justice, power, the good life that don't just go away.
And he had an interesting take on detachment, too. It doesn't mean neutrality.
Right. Germino argued that philosophical detachment isn't the same as ethical indifference. A political philosopher, concerned with right and wrong, cannot be neutral about political struggles in the way a value-free scientist might claim to be.
He also seemed skeptical about simply merging behavioralism and philosophy.
Very skeptical. He argued that a science focused solely on observable facts and aiming for value neutrality couldn't really nurture political philosophy. The gap was too wide. He warned that theory detached from fundamental philosophical concerns becomes irrelevant.
And he criticized behavioralism for sometimes just propping up the status quo.
Yes, by focusing only on describing what is, without asking what should be, it could implicitly endorse the existing system and fail to perform the vital Socratic function of questioning power and conventional wisdom. He felt a true recovery needed to break free from the limitations of positivism.
Herbert Marcuse added another warning related to language.
Yes, Marcuse cautioned that forcing social science language to mimic natural science language, focusing only on operational definitions like defining democracy just by voter turnout, could stifle critical thinking.
How so?
Because it leaves no room for the deeper question. Does this system, even with high turnout, actually live up to the ideals of democracy? Is it truly just? He worried that this kind of operationalism could turn science into an instrument of social control, just managing the existing system rather than critical inquiry into its legitimacy.
Wow, so that whole decline debate was really a battle for the soul of political studies. Science versus philosophy, facts versus values, description versus critique.
It absolutely was. A profound questioning of the purpose and methods of the entire field.
So where did things land after all that? The source suggests the intense conflict eased up after the 1970s.
Yes, the narrative shifts towards synthesis and complementarity. Easton's post-behavioral turn was a big signal acknowledging that science needs to engage with values and real-world problems.
And philosophers became more willing to engage with empirical data.
Exactly. The lines blurred. Philosophers like Rawls used empirical assumptions in their theories. Critics like McPherson used empirical analysis to challenge existing theories. Thinkers like Marcuse and Habermas integrated deep empirical insights into their philosophical critiques. It became less of an either-or situation.
So the consensus now, according to the source, is that they work together.
Pretty much. Political science helps us understand and strengthen our means, how political systems operate, how to achieve goals, the factual basis of political life.
And political philosophy helps us determine our ends, what goals are actually worth pursuing, what constitutes a just and good society, what principles should guide us.
And since means and ends are obviously linked, you can't achieve good ends without effective means, and means are pointless without worthy ends. The two aspects are seen as complementary and interdependent.
Both necessary parts of the larger enterprise of political theory.
Correct. The source concludes that today, all the functions we've discussed, description, explanation, criticism, reconstruction, clarification, are seen as important and urgent.
Especially given the complex problems we face globally.
Right. And it circles back to that warning. Without this rigorous combined effort of science and philosophy, politics is vulnerable. Political theory, in its fullness, is presented as essential for navigating our collective challenges thoughtfully and responsibly.
That really brings us full circle. We started trying to define political, explored the systematic knowledge of theory, saw its two vital components, science dealing with facts, philosophy with values, and crucially, how they need each other.
We looked at why it all matters for understanding, criticizing, improving society, clarifying our concepts, and even fostering better debate. And we navigated that whole mid-century storm over the decline of theory.
Seeing how the push for pure science clashed with the need for philosophical critique, and how thinkers wrestled with the role of values.
And we've ended up with this view of science and philosophy as complementary tools, both indispensable for understanding and shaping the political world.
And hopefully, for you listening, tracing this journey helps make sense of the complex ideas swirling around in political discussions. It gives you perhaps a framework to analyze arguments. Is this claim based on facts, on logic, on values?
It equips you to ask those deeper questions, to challenge assumptions, both your own and others, to engage more critically with the world.
Thinking about that distinction the source emphasized between detached scholarly theory and committed ideology, it really does make you pause.
It does. In a world flooded with information, much of it highly partisan, striving for that kind of intellectual honesty, that willingness to follow the evidence, even if it's uncomfortable, that's a real challenge.
So maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. Given how easily ideology can cloud our judgment, as the source warns, how vigilant do we need to be individually and collectively in seeking that scholarly detachment, that commitment to understanding the political world as accurately and fairly as possible, even when it contradicts our own preferred narratives?
That's definitely something worth pondering.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the foundations of political theory.